The horrifying transformation, how England's golden king became a rotting monster. What if I told you that one of history's most powerful kings died in such a grotesque, horrifying way that his own government covered it up for over 450 years? What if the truth was so disturbing that even seasoned courtiers, men who had witnessed executions and wars, vomited in the royal presence? You're about to discover the shocking medical evidence that proves Henry VIII's transformation from golden Renaissance prince to a 400-pound monster whose very flesh rotted while he lived. But this isn't just another history lesson. This is the story of how a single moment, one catastrophic accident, turned England's most charismatic ruler into something barely recognizable as human. And here's what will shock you most. The evidence was hidden in secret medical records, buried in palace archives, and suppressed by Tudor historians who couldn't bear the truth. But now, after centuries of lies, forensic examination of his actual remains has revealed what really happened to the king who changed England forever. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because to understand the horror of Henry's end, you need to know how it all began, with a sound that echoed across Greenwich Palace like thunder. January 24th, 1536. Can you picture it? The most magnificent court in Europe gathered at Greenwich Palace, their breath visible in the winter air as they watched their king prepare for what should have been just another tournament. Henry VIII, still the golden athlete at 44, sits astride his massive destrier, a war horse bred for battle, trained to crush enemies beneath its hooves. The crowd falls silent as their king adjusts his lance, each piece of his armor worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. The afternoon sun catches the polished metal, turning Henry into a glittering god of war. This is the Renaissance prince who speaks 4 languages, writes poetry that moves hearts, composes music that fills cathedrals with beauty. But what happens in the next 60 seconds will destroy all of that forever. The trumpet sounds. 2 armored titans charge toward each other at breakneck speed. The ground trembles. The crowd holds its breath. And then... crash. The impact hits like a modern car collision. Henry's massive war horse, weighted down with armor, stumbles and falls. 300 pounds of king and metal slam into the frozen earth. But that's not the worst part. Oh no, that's just the beginning. The crowd gasps in absolute horror as they watch Henry's own destrier, this massive beast of war, fall directly on top of their king. The silence that follows isn't just quiet. It's the terrifying silence of a kingdom that might have just lost everything. For 2 hours, 2 entire hours, Henry VIII lay unconscious. 2 hours where England had no king. 2 hours where Anne Boleyn, pregnant and desperate for a male heir, waited in agony, not knowing if her future had just been crushed along with her husband. But when Henry finally opened his eyes, the witnesses saw something that chilled them to the bone. Those eyes, once bright with intelligence and charm that could seduce queens and intimidate emperors, now held something different, something darker, something that made even hardened courtiers step back in instinctive fear. Here's what most people don't know about that fateful day. The accident didn't just scramble Henry's brain. It tore open an old wound on his leg that had healed years before, and this time it would never close again. Now, imagine living with open sores the size of tennis balls on both legs, not for days, not for weeks, but for 11 agonizing years. Picture wounds that constantly weep pus, that never fully scab over, where even the softest silk bed sheets touching your skin would make you scream in agony. This was Henry's new reality, and in Tudor England, Without antibiotics or understanding of infection, this open wound was essentially a slow death sentence. Dr. Thomas Vickery's secret notes, hidden in the Royal College of Physicians and only discovered in the 1960s, describe ulcers of a grievous nature, stinking and painful beyond measure. The king's legs had to be drained daily, sometimes twice daily, filling bronze bowls with infected fluid that servants would quickly rush away from the royal presence. But here's where Henry's vanity becomes truly tragic. Desperate to hide his deterioration, he designed special garters with lead weights to compress the wounds, believing pressure would force them closed. Instead, this cut off circulation and made the infection catastrophically worse. He doused himself in expensive perfumes from Arabia, mixing rose oil with ambergris to mask the stench. He even commanded his portrait painters to show him with impossibly athletic legs, standing in that famous power stance we all recognize from history books. But the infection wasn't just destroying his legs. Every single day, toxins from the rotting tissue entered his bloodstream, traveling to his brain, his liver, his heart. Modern medical analysis reveals Henry likely developed chronic osteomyelitis, a bone infection that releases a constant stream of bacteria throughout the body. Can you imagine the agony? The worst toothache you've ever experienced, but in your legs, never stopping for over a decade. Fever that left him drenched in sweat one day, shivering with chills the next. Most devastating of all were the neurological effects as toxins crossed into his brain tissue. One moment he might be laughing at a jest, the next ordering the jester's execution. Paranoid delusions became his new normal. He began seeing enemies everywhere, convinced servants were poisoning his food, that his wives were committing adultery, that foreign assassins lurked in every shadow. By 1540, just 4 years after the accident, Henry had executed his second wife, annulled his marriage to his third, and was already hunting for number 4. The young Catherine Howard caught his eye, a girl of perhaps 17 to his 50 years. The contrast must have been grotesque. A king so obese he needed servants to lift him onto his horse, pursuing a teenager who reportedly needed wine just to endure his advances. But wait until you discover what happened when those wounds finally turned septic. The year 1542 marked the point of no return. The ulcers, that had been manageable, if disgusting, for 6 years suddenly transformed into something far more sinister. Dr. Vickery's notes describe a terrifying change where once the discharge had been yellow-white pus, now it turned green, then brown. The smell evolved from merely foul to something witnesses described as the stench of death itself. And Henry's body, it began expanding like some grotesque balloon. Unable to exercise due to the leg pain, eating constantly to distract from his misery, he exploded from an already hefty 280 pounds to well over 350. His armor tells the shocking story. Preserved in the Tower of London, it shows a 48-inch waist in 1540. By 1545, new armor had to be commissioned with a 54-inch waist measurement. Let that number sink in for a moment. 54 inches. That's larger than most modern refrigerators. The palace itself had to be modified to accommodate the king's new bulk. Doorways were widened. You can still see the construction marks at Hampton Court today. Floors were reinforced with additional beams after Henry's weight caused dangerous sagging. Special chairs were built with removable arms because the king could no longer fit between them. His daily routine became an elaborate performance designed to hide his deterioration. He would be dressed while lying in bed, a process requiring 4 servants to manage his massive limbs. A system of pulleys and slings was installed just to lift him upright. He would then be transferred to a wheeled chair, though this was carefully concealed from public view. But the physical transformation was nothing compared to what was happening inside his mind. By 1544, courtiers reported behavior that went far beyond bad temper into the realm of complete madness. Henry would hold entire conversations with people who weren't there. He was observed arguing with his dead father, Henry VII, defending his expenditure of the royal treasury. He would call out for his mother, Elizabeth of York, who had died when he was just 11 years old. Most disturbing of all were his interactions with the ghosts of his victims. Multiple witnesses reported seeing the king suddenly stop mid-sentence during state business, his face draining of color, staring at empty air. He would whisper, "No, not now," or "Leave me be," before exploding in rage at his confused counselors. One particularly chilling account from the French ambassador describes Henry suddenly screaming at an empty chair, ordering Anne Boleyn to stop laughing at him. The king's paranoia reached extraordinary heights. He became convinced his servants were trying to poison him through his leg bandages. He would demand that the pus-soaked dressings be brought to him for inspection, sniffing them suspiciously before allowing them to be burned. He hired food tasters not just for his meals, but for his medicines, forcing unfortunate servants to apply his ointments to their own skin first to test for poison. By Christmas 1546, Henry had become something barely recognizable as human. Contemporary accounts describe a massive figure propped up in his throne, unable to stand without assistance. His face had swollen to nearly twice its original size, features distorted by fluid retention. His eyes, once a bright blue that poets compared to summer skies, had become yellowish and bloodshot, sunk deep in pouches of discolored flesh. The smell emanating from the royal person had become impossible to disguise. Despite pounds of perfume, regular burning of incense, and fresh herbs scattered on floors, the stench of decay followed Henry wherever he went. Courtiers would discreetly hold pomanders to their noses when approaching the throne. Some of the more delicate ladies would excuse themselves and vomit after mandatory appearances before the king. But here's something that will absolutely shock you about how desperate he became to hide his condition. Henry's final portrait, the famous Whitehall portrait that became the template for how we imagine him today, contains a devastating secret that historians tried to hide for centuries. When the painting was X-rayed in 1960 during restoration, conservators made a horrifying discovery. The king's left hand, which appears to be gripping a simple walking cane, was originally painted holding something else entirely, a wooden staff topped with a human skull. This macabre walking stick wasn't just Gothic fashion. Henry had become so obsessed with death that he carried this reminder everywhere. He would tap the skull against the floor during conversations, a nervous tick that unnerved even his most loyal courtiers. The skull itself was rumored to belong to a monk from one of the dissolved monasteries, though some whispered it belonged to one of his executed enemies. Hans Holbein had painted this disturbing detail accurately, but after Henry's death, his son Edward VI ordered it painted over. The young king couldn't bear the thought of his father being remembered as the death-obsessed madman he had become. Court records from those final months paint a picture of a court living in absolute terror. Henry's mood swings had become so extreme that courtiers developed an elaborate warning system using colored ribbons, red for rage, black for depression, white for the increasingly rare moments of calm. The king would fly into murderous rages over the smallest provocations. A servant who sneezed during a royal audience was dragged away for interrogation as a possible assassin using poison powder. A lady-in-waiting who accidentally stepped on the king's robe was banished from court, her family's lands confiscated. Most terrifying of all, Henry began ordering executions of people who were already dead, having forgotten he'd killed them years earlier. One particularly chilling incident occurred during a state banquet in November 1546. The French ambassador reported that mid-meal, Henry suddenly stood up, a process requiring several servants and causing him visible agony, and began shouting at an empty chair. "You dare show your face at my table, witch?" he screamed, pointing at nothing. The court sat frozen as Henry continued his tirade against what he clearly believed was Anne Boleyn's ghost. "I took your head once. I'll take it again." He then collapsed back into his chair, seemingly exhausted, and resumed eating as if nothing had happened. But what came next in those final weeks was so disturbing that the mere description of it will haunt you. January 1547, Whitehall Palace. Henry VIII enters his final decline, and what happens next is so revolting that his own government suppressed the records for centuries. The ulcers on his legs had grown beyond anything the physicians had ever seen. Dr. Thomas Wendy's suppressed medical notes, discovered in a private collection in 1891, describe wounds so deep that bone was clearly visible. The flesh around the ulcers had turned black, clear evidence of gangrene setting in. The smell had become absolutely unbearable. Servants fainted while changing the king's bedsheets. Windows had to be kept open despite the freezing January weather, because the stench would fill any closed room within minutes. Henry's body had become a putrid mass of corruption. His skin had turned sickly yellow from liver failure. The whites of his eyes matched, giving him an inhuman appearance. His tongue swelled so badly he could barely speak, his words coming out as wet, gurgling sounds that required his closest servants to interpret. His massive weight made caring for him nearly impossible. It took 6 strong men just to turn him in bed to prevent bed sores, though by this point sores had developed anyway, adding to the catalogue of rotting flesh. His legs had swollen to such an extent that the skin split in multiple places, weeping clear fluid that soaked through dozens of bandages daily. But here's the detail that will haunt your dreams about his suffering. On January 20th, Henry experienced what physicians now recognize as the beginning of multiple organ failure. His kidneys, overwhelmed by the constant flood of toxins from his infected legs, began shutting down. His urine, when he could produce any, was dark brown and reeked of ammonia. The king's mental state during these final days alternated between terrifying clarity and complete delirium. In his lucid moments he knew he was dying. He would beg his physicians to save him, promising them wealth beyond imagining. When they failed, he would rage at them, threatening torture and execution, though he lacked the strength to sign the warrants. In his delirious periods, Henry revealed the true depths of his terror. He would cry out for his mother, dead for nearly 40 years, begging her to protect him from demons he saw crawling from beneath his bed. He would have conversations with his brother Arthur, who had died in 1502, apologizing for taking his throne and his wife. Most pathetically, he would call out for his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, asking her forgiveness, though she had died alone and abandoned 11 years earlier. On January 27th, Henry suffered what modern physicians would recognize as a massive stroke. The right side of his face drooped grotesquely. Drool pooled on his pillow as he lost control of his facial muscles. His speech became completely incomprehensible. England's mighty king, who had once commanded the reformation of an entire religion with his words, couldn't even ask for water. Yet even in this state, paralyzed and rotting, Henry tried to maintain his tyrannical control. Using his one functioning hand, he attempted to sign death warrants. His final intended victim was the Duke of Norfolk, who had served him faithfully for decades. The signature was an illegible scrawl, more inkblot than name. Only Henry's death the next day saved Norfolk from the scaffold. But here's where the story takes its most horrifying turn, one that historians have desperately tried to hide for centuries. That Henry VIII didn't die peacefully in his sleep like the official records claim. He died screaming in absolute terror, and what happened to his body afterward was so grotesque it became the stuff of nightmares. Archbishop Cranmer's private diary, discovered in Lambeth Palace Library in 1983, provides the only eyewitness account of Henry's final hours. Cranmer had been summoned to provide last rites, arriving at the palace near midnight on January 27th. What he found in the royal bedchamber shocked even this experienced clergyman who had witnessed countless deathbeds. Henry was experiencing seizures so violent that 6 men had to hold him down to prevent him from injuring himself further. His massive body convulsed with such force that the reinforced bed frame cracked under the strain. Between seizures, he would vomit black bile, a clear sign that his digestive system was hemorrhaging internally. The smell was so overwhelming that Cranmer had to excuse himself twice to vomit. During brief moments of stillness, Henry's eyes would focus on things that weren't there. He cried out for his dead children, the miscarriages and stillbirths that had plagued his desperate quest for heirs. He begged them to forgive him, promised to be a better father if they would just come back. Then his voice would change, becoming high and terrified, as he screamed about flames and demanded that someone put out the fire that only he could see. As the clock approached 2 in the morning on January 28th, Henry's breathing changed to what medical professionals call the death rattle, a wet gurgling sound as the lungs fill with fluid. Following Protestant doctrine, Cranmer asked the dying king to give a sign if he trusted in Christ for salvation. The archbishop took Henry's massive, swollen hand and asked him to squeeze if he died in the faith of Jesus Christ. Henry squeezed once, weakly. Then his grip went slack. At 2:07 a.m., January 28, 1547, King Henry VIII of England was dead. But the true horror was just beginning. Henry's corpse began decomposing with shocking speed. The infection that had ravaged his body for years didn't stop with death, it accelerated. Within hours, his already bloated body swelled even larger as bacteria produced gases inside the corpse. The smell, impossibly, grew even worse. Servants stationed outside the death chamber could be heard retching in the corridors. The Privy Council, led by Edward Seymour, made the extraordinary decision to keep Henry's death secret for 3 days. This wasn't just political maneuvering. They needed time to figure out how to handle the rapidly deteriorating corpse that was too large and too decomposed to display publicly without causing a scandal. Embalmers were summoned urgently, but they faced an impossible task. When they opened Henry's body to remove the organs for preservation, they discovered the full extent of the internal decay. The liver was so enlarged and diseased, it literally fell apart when touched. The heart, swollen to nearly twice normal size, was surrounded by yellow fluid. The intestines were black with gangrene. One embalmer's assistant fainted when the stomach was opened, releasing such a concentrated stench that workers fled the room gasping for air. The embalmers worked frantically for 2 days, using techniques that would be considered extreme even by Tudor standards. They packed the body cavity with over 100 pounds of salt and aromatic herbs. They wrapped the corpse in waxed cloth soaked in turpentine. They sealed everything in a massive lead coffin that required special reinforcement to hold the weight. But even these extraordinary measures couldn't contain Henry's decay. During the lying-in state at Whitehall, witnesses reported strange sounds coming from the coffin, pops and gurgles as gases continued to build inside the sealed container. The lid began to bulge outward, forcing officials to hurriedly drape more black cloth over the coffin to hide its distortion. Then came the procession to Windsor Castle on February 14th, and what happened next defies belief. Henry's coffin, weighing nearly half a ton with its reinforcements, required a specially built carriage pulled by 8 of the strongest horses in England. The journey that should have taken 1 day stretched to 3 as the horses struggled with the weight and roads turned to mud under winter rain. On the second night, the procession stopped at Sion Abbey, ironically, one of the very monasteries Henry had dissolved years earlier. The coffin was placed in the chapel overnight, and what happened next was so grotesque it passed into legend. The pressure from the gases inside Henry's decomposing corpse finally became too much for even the reinforced lead coffin to contain. At some point during the night, it split open with a sound witnesses described as like a thunderclap echoing through the ancient chapel. Putrid fluids leaked out, pooling on the chapel floor. The smell was so overwhelming that guards abandoned their posts, fleeing into the night air. But the final indignity was yet to come. In the morning, workers discovered that dogs had entered the chapel during the night. They found the animals licking at the pooled fluids that had leaked from their king's coffin. The man who had styled himself as God's anointed representative on earth, who had broken from Rome itself to assert his divine right to rule, ended up as food for scavenging dogs. Palace workers used sawdust and lime to soak up the remains, working with cloths tied over their faces against the stench. The coffin was hastily resealed with fresh lead, though the damage to royal dignity was complete. When the procession finally reached Windsor Castle, Henry was buried quickly and quietly, without the elaborate ceremony originally planned. This grotesque scene was so damaging to royal prestige that Edward Seymour ordered all witnesses to absolute silence on pain of death. The official record stated simply that Henry had died peacefully and been buried with all appropriate honors. The truth was hidden so effectively that it only emerged centuries later through private diaries and foreign diplomatic reports. So there you have it, the complete, uncensored truth about Henry VIII's death. The king who executed wives, demolished monasteries, and terrorized a nation died rotting from the inside out, screaming in terror as his own body became his final enemy. The golden Renaissance prince, who had once been called the handsomest ruler in Christendom, ended his life as a 400-pound mass of infection and decay, abandoned by his terrified courtiers, his final remains literally licked up by stray dogs. From that single jousting accident in 1536 to his grotesque end in 1547, we witnessed the slow-motion destruction of not just a king, but of kingship itself. Henry's transformation from charming prince to rotting tyrant shows us how quickly power can corrupt, how vanity can blind us to reality, and how the human body can become a prison of unimaginable suffering. But perhaps most chilling of all is how effectively this truth was buried. For over 4 centuries, historians, governments, and institutions conspired to hide the reality of Henry's end. because it was simply too horrifying to acknowledge. It makes you wonder, what other truths about power, about history, about the people we're taught to admire, are still buried in archives, waiting to be discovered? What other carefully crafted myths are hiding realities too disturbing for us to face? The next time you see that iconic portrait of Henry VIII in his commanding pose, remember what lies beneath that painted facade. Remember the man who died in screaming agony, whose body exploded in its own coffin, whose remains fed dogs in a ruined monastery. Because sometimes the most important history is the history they tried to hide.